There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the simple weight of a body breathing in the room next to you. You don't recognize them as architecture, as the load-bearing walls of what your life is about to become. You simply feel a subtle shift in the air, a change in the pressure of the silence, and you mark it down as tiredness, or weather, or nothing at all. For me, that moment was the sound of Leo's breathing, a slow and steady tide pulling in and out from the shores of my living room couch. It was a sound I was becoming accustomed to, a new piece of the apartment's ambient noise, but on that particular night, it felt less like a sound and more like a question being asked of the universe, with me as its sole, unwilling witness. He was sprawled there, a study in casual exhaustion. One arm was flung over his eyes to block the sliver of moonlight forcing its way through the gap in the curtains, a stubborn silver blade. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm that felt both deeply personal and universally ancient, the simple mechanics of being alive. I sat in the armchair across from him, a book open on my lap, its words having long since blurred into meaningless shapes on the page. I hadn't turned a page in over an hour. My focus was entirely consumed by the cartography of his sleep, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the slight furrow in his brow that even rest couldn't seem to smooth away, the slackness in his jaw that spoke of a surrender he rarely allowed himself when conscious. This was Leo, the sprinter, the man built of kinetic energy and forward momentum, finally at a standstill. And in his stillness, my own world had ground to a halt. It had started 3 months ago, this slow colonization of my space. It began with excuses that were just plausible enough to believe. A late night at his consulting firm downtown, a missed last train, the classic, "Is it cool if I just crash here? I'm too wired to drive." I, of course, had always said yes. Our friendship was built on that easy affirmative. It was a structure we had assembled over years, plank by sturdy plank, a shelter against the less predictable weather of our lives. So when he began to leave a toothbrush in my bathroom, tucked away in the back of the medicine cabinet, as if it were a secret, or a spare sweatshirt in the bottom drawer of my dresser, I treated it as the natural evolution of that structure. An annex being built, an expansion. I did not allow myself to see it for what it was, a quiet, desperate siege. Tonight, there had been no excuse. He had simply appeared at my door after work, a bag of takeout in one hand and a familiar weariness in his eyes. He hadn't asked if he could stay. He hadn't needed to. We ate. We watched some mindless television show, and somewhere between the third and fourth episode, his steady stream of dry commentary had tapered off into silence. I had looked over to see him exactly as he was now, surrendered to the cushions and the quiet dark. I should have woken him, should have nudged his shoulder and told him to take the spare room, the one with the proper bed and the door that closed. But I didn't. I couldn't bring myself to disturb the peace that had settled over him, a fragile truce in a war I was only beginning to understand he was fighting. Instead, I had simply pulled the thick wool blanket from the back of my chair and draped it over him, my fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before retreating from the warmth of his shoulder. And now I watched, cataloging the details like a photographer composing a shot, trying to find the meaning in the arrangement of light and shadow, in the stillness of my friend who had somehow become the most kinetic object in my life. To understand the weight of that silence, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. Leo and I met in college, two celestial bodies pulled into the same unlikely orbit by the gravitational force of the university's track team. He was the star, the sprinter, a tightly coiled spring of muscle and charisma who exploded out of the blocks and devoured the 100-meter dash in a blur of controlled violence. His laughter was loud and frequent, echoing across the practice field, drawing people in. He collected friends the way some people collect stamps, effortlessly, his charm and adhesive that made everyone want to stick around. I, on the other hand, was a creature of the long distance. My events were the 5 and 10,000 meters, grueling tests of endurance and solitude. I was quiet, observant, more comfortable in the periphery than the spotlight. My world was one of measured breaths and steady pacing, of finding a rhythm and sinking into it for miles, my mind a quiet, empty room where I could process the world from a safe distance. We shouldn't have been friends. Our social circles barely overlapped. Our energies were polar opposites. But the track was a great equalizer. It stripped you down to your component parts: muscle, bone, and will. After brutal afternoon practices under a punishing sun, we would all collapse onto the cool grass of the infield, a sprawl of exhausted limbs and ragged breathing. And in those moments of shared depletion, hierarchies dissolved. It was there, lying on our backs and staring up at the vast, indifferent blue of the sky, that we first started to really talk. He'd ask about my photography, a hobby I pursued with the same quiet intensity as my running. I'd ask about the complex coding problems he was untangling for his computer science degree. Our conversations were an odd mix of the technical and the abstract, of shutter speeds and algorithms, of the feeling of hitting the wall in the last kilometer and the logic of a recursive function. He was, I discovered, profoundly different from the person he presented to the world. The easy confidence was a well-constructed facade, a performance he had perfected. Beneath it, there was a restless, analytical mind that was constantly turning things over, searching for patterns, for order. He was lonely in a way that only people surrounded by crowds can be. I was lonely in a more conventional sense, a natural consequence of my own introversion. We recognized the same quiet ache in each other, even if its source was different. Our friendship solidified in the university library, in the hushed, sterile air of the third-floor stacks. We became study partners, a symbiotic relationship. He would help me debug my rudimentary attempts at coding for a digital art project, and I would act as a sounding board for his increasingly complex theses, my patient listening somehow helping him untangle the knots in his own logic. I was, he once told me, like a human version of rubber duck debugging, a silent presence he could explain things to until the solution became clear. I didn't mind. I liked being his quiet place. It was during one of those late nights, surrounded by the smell of old paper and dust, that I realized my feelings for him had undergone a subtle chemical change. It wasn't a sudden, explosive realization like his start from the blocks. It was more like the slow, creeping burn in my muscles during a long run, a feeling that builds so gradually you don't notice its intensity until it's a part of you, a constant, undeniable presence. He had been hunched over his laptop, brow furrowed in concentration, the fluorescent library lights carving sharp shadows into the planes of his face. He'd let out a frustrated sigh and run a hand through his hair, a gesture that was so quintessentially Leo. And in that simple, unguarded moment, a door in my carefully ordered internal world had swung silently open, revealing a room I never knew existed, a room filled entirely with the thought of him. I felt a sudden, terrifying lurch in my chest, the feeling of the ground giving way beneath me. I had promptly looked down at my own textbook, my heart hammering against my ribs, and pretended to be engrossed in a chapter one couldn't read. From that day forward, our friendship became a tightrope walk. I became a meticulous archivist of his every word, his every gesture, searching for hidden meanings that weren't there. A casual arm slung around my shoulder, a shared laugh that brought his face close to mine, an offhand compliment about a photograph I'd taken. Each was a clue to be analyzed, a piece of data to be entered into a vast, internal equation that never resolved. I became an expert in self-containment, building higher and higher walls around that secret room inside me. It was exhausting. He had a girlfriend then, Chloe, a bright, kind art history major who fit with him in a way that made perfect, painful sense. I liked her, which only made it harder. I watched them together, a perfect composition of light and balance, and I learned to be the supportive friend, the quiet observer in the background of their frame. I told myself it was enough. Being his friend, his safe harbor, his human rubber duck, was a privilege. It had to be enough. And for years, it was. The shift began with a phone call on a rainy Tuesday in October, 3 years after we'd graduated. Leo's voice on the other end of the line was flat, hollowed out. He and Chloe had broken up. There was no drama, no shouting match, no single, cataclysmic event. It was, he explained in that monotone, a simple erosion. A slow, silent drifting apart until they were standing on separate continents, shouting across an ocean of what they used to be. It just ended, he said, and the simplicity of the phrase was more devastating than any detailed explanation could have been. He didn't sound sad so much as bewildered, like an astronaut who had returned to Earth to find that gravity worked differently now. He was unmoored, and he was calling me his anchor. I did what any friend would do. I told him to come over. I ordered his favorite pizza. I opened a bottle of whiskey we'd been saving. I prepared myself for a night of tears, of angry tirades, of the usual post-breakup exorcism. But none of that happened. He arrived looking like a photograph that had been slightly overexposed, the colors washed out, the edges blurred. He sat on my couch, picked at the pizza, and stared at the television without seeing it. He spoke very little about Chloe. Instead, he talked about work, about a frustrating bug in his latest project, about the new season of a show we both liked. He was building a wall of normalcy around the gaping hole in his life, brick by mundane brick. I didn't push. I let him lead, sensing that the silence around the topic of the breakup was more significant than any words could be. He fell asleep on the couch around midnight, his glass of whiskey still half full on the coffee table. I watched him for a long time, just as I was watching him now, 3 months later. That first night, it felt like an anomaly, a temporary state of emergency. I had found him a blanket and left him there, the geography of his grief too vast and unknown for me to dare navigate. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, leaving only a neatly folded blanket on the cushion and a text message. Thanks for last night. I owe you 1 inch, but it wasn't a one-time event. It was the beginning of a pattern. A few days later, he was back, this time with the excuse of wanting to borrow a book. He stayed for dinner. He stayed for a movie. He fell asleep on the couch again. This became the new rhythm of our lives. His appearances at my door grew more frequent, the excuses thinner, until they disappeared altogether. He stopped pretending he was there for any reason other than to simply be there. My apartment, with its quiet corners and the smell of darkroom chemicals, became his sanctuary from his own, which I imagined felt cavernous and loud with the echoes of a shared life. He never spoke of his loneliness, but I could see it. It was in the way he'd trail his fingers along the spines of my books, the way he'd stand by the window and watch the traffic below for long stretches of time, the way his shoulders would slump in a moment of unguardedness when he thought I wasn't looking. He was a ship taking on water, and my quiet, ordered life was the only dry dock he knew. The couch was the first boundary to blur. It became his unofficial bed. I always offered the spare room, a genuine, standing offer. Leo, you know the guest room is always there. You can get a proper night's sleep. He would always demur with a wave of his hand. Nah, man, this is fine. I'll be out of your hair in the morning. Don't want to be a pain. It was, I knew, a lie. Not a malicious one, but a necessary one. He didn't want the isolation of a separate room, the finality of a closed door. He wanted the proximity, the quiet assurance that another person was breathing in the same space. He needed the ambient comfort of my presence, the low light of my reading lamp as I stayed up late, the soft clicks of my keyboard as I edited photos. He was drawing a circle of safety around himself, and for reasons I couldn't yet fathom, he had decided I was its center. My internal world, already a carefully managed ecosystem, was thrown into chaos. Every evening he spent at my apartment was a tightrope walk over a canyon of hope and fear. My senses became hyper-attuned to him. I was aware of the precise space between us on the couch, of the way the air temperature changed when he walked into a room, of the subtle shift in the timbre of his voice when he was truly tired. I was living in a state of excruciating, delicious suspense. It was like being in the darkroom, watching an image slowly emerge in the developing tray. For long minutes, there is only the blank, white paper submerged in the chemical bath. You wait in the dim, red safety light, holding your breath. Then, faint lines begin to appear, ghosts of a future image. A shadow deepens here, a highlight clarifies there. You can't rush it. You can only watch and wait, and hope that the image that finally resolves is the one you intended to capture. Leo was my photograph, developing in the slow, silent chemistry of our shared evenings, and I was terrified of what the final picture would reveal. The ritual escalated on a cold night in mid-December. The wind was howling outside, rattling the old window frames of my building. We had just finished a movie, a tense thriller that had left a residue of anxiety in the air. I was getting up to turn off the television when Leo spoke from the couch, his voice low. Hey, Jules. I turned. He was sitting up, hugging a cushion to his chest. This is going to sound weird, but My apartment's heating is on the fritz. It's like an icebox over there. I think I'd freeze tonight. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was another of his gentle fictions. But it was a new one, a more specific one. It was a fiction with a purpose. I just didn't know what that purpose was yet. You can take the spare room, I said, my voice steady, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. I'll get you some extra blankets. He shook his head, not looking at me. He was staring at the floor, at the pattern on my rug. It's not just that, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. I had a bad dream last night. Stupid, I know. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were wide with a vulnerability that stole the air from my lungs. It was the look of a child in the dark, and it shattered the last of my defenses. Would it be? Would it be completely insane if I just crashed in here with you? He asked, the words rushing out in a single breath, as if he was afraid they would evaporate if he spoke them too slowly. He gestured vaguely toward my bedroom. The question hung in the air between us, shimmering with a terrifying potential. This was a new threshold, a door he was asking me to open. All my internal alarms were screaming. This was dangerous. This was a line from which there might be no return. But the sight of him, so frayed and lost, overrode every instinct for self-preservation. The part of me that loved him, the part one had kept under lock and key for years, simply took over. No, I said, my voice softer than I intended. It wouldn't be insane. He didn't move for a moment, just watched me, as if trying to decipher the code of my response. Then he gave a small, grateful nod. The tension in his shoulders seemed to dissipate, melting away. He stood up, and the atmosphere in the room felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had changed. We moved toward the bedroom in a strange, unspoken choreography. I was hyper-aware of every sound. The scuff of his socks on the hardwood floor, the creak of the door as I pushed it open, the rustle of fabric as I pulled back the duvet. I got into my side of the bed, the side I always slept on, and he hesitated for a beat before taking the other. The mattress dipped under his weight, a small, seismic event that sent a tremor through my entire body. We lay there in the dark, on our backs, a foot of empty space between us, a chasm of unspoken things. The silence was immense. It was no longer the comfortable, ambient silence of our evenings on the couch. This was a dense, weighted silence, filled with the sound of our breathing, two distinct rhythms trying to find a common tempo. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small gap, a tangible presence in the cool air of the room. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to regulate my own breathing, trying to project an aura of casual normalcy that I was nowhere close to feeling. My body was a live wire. Every nerve ending was alight, screaming with the proximity of him. I was certain he could hear the frantic drumming of my heart. I was certain it was loud enough to shake the bed frame. After what felt like an eternity, he shifted. He rolled onto his side, facing away from me, his back a solid, dark shape in the gloom. It was a gesture of retreat, a re-establishment of a boundary. I felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. The relief was for my own sanity. The disappointment was a deeper, more painful ache. I took it as my cue. I rolled onto my own side, facing away from him, so that we were two parentheses, back to back, enclosing a vast, empty space. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought we would simply lie like that, in our separate, silent worlds, until sleep finally claimed us. But then, I felt a subtle movement. His foot, perhaps unconsciously, brushed against mine. It was a fleeting touch, featherlight, probably accidental. But it sent a jolt of electricity straight up my spine. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. We remained like that, connected by that single, tentative point of contact, two islands suddenly joined by a fragile, invisible bridge. And in the profound, consuming darkness of my room, I closed my eyes and allowed myself, for the first time, to simply feel the hope of it. That night became the new ritual. The fiction of the broken heating was never mentioned again. It had served its purpose and was discarded. From then on, when he stayed over, it was simply understood that he would end up in my bed. We never discussed it. He would watch a movie on the couch until he grew tired, and then he would rise without a word and head to my bedroom, and a few minutes later, I would follow. We maintained the pretense of our separate sides, our backs turned to one another, a carefully preserved fiction of platonic cohabitation. But the accidental touches became less accidental. A foot brushing against an ankle, a hand straying across the median line in the night and resting, for a moment, on my arm. His hair, once, brushing against the back of my neck as he shifted in his sleep. Each touch was a spark in the dark, a silent communication I was desperate to understand. I lived for those nights, and I dreaded them. They were a form of exquisite torture. To be so close to what I wanted most, and yet to be separated by an impassable gulf of silence and ambiguity. My days were spent in a fog of anticipation, my nights in a state of heightened, sleepless awareness. I was a photographer living in perpetual twilight, never quite getting enough light to capture a clear image. Was this just comfort for him? Was I a human security blanket, a warm body to ward off the ghosts of his loneliness? Or was there something more stirring in the quiet depths of him, something he himself didn't understand? I would lie awake for hours, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, trying to decipher its meaning. A sigh in his sleep, a slight mumble of a word I couldn't catch. I collected these fragments like precious artifacts, turning them over and over in my mind, searching for their significance. He started talking in the dark, not in his sleep, but in the quiet, liminal space before it. He would lie there, his back to me, and he would begin to speak in a low voice, the words directed at the wall, or the universe, or perhaps at me. He told me things he had never said out loud in the light of day. He talked about his father, a demanding, emotionally distant man whose approval he had been chasing his entire life. He talked about the immense pressure he felt at his job, the fear of being seen as an imposter, of not being as brilliant as everyone seemed to think he was. He talked about his breakup with Chloe, not with sadness, but with a kind of detached confusion. I think, he whispered into the darkness one night, his voice thick with sleep, I think I was more in love with the idea of what we were supposed to be than what we actually were. A perfect picture. But the picture was empty. I never knew how to respond. The intimacy of these confessions was staggering. He was handing me the fragile, broken pieces of himself, trusting me to hold them. I was his priest in a dark confessional, his therapist in a silent session. My role was simply to listen, to absorb. So I would lie there, my body rigid with the effort of remaining still, and I would offer him the only thing I could, the gift of my silent, unwavering attention. I don't trust many people, Jules, he said one night, out of the blue. The statement was so stark, so simple. It landed in the quiet room with the weight of a stone. My heart clenched. I know. I whispered back to the space between us. It was all I could manage. He didn't say anything more after that, but the air had changed. He had drawn a circle and placed me firmly inside it. It was a terrifying, beautiful place to be. The breaking point came, as these things so often do, on an utterly ordinary night. It was a Thursday in early spring, the air outside still holding a winter chill, but carrying the faint, hopeful scent of rain and damp earth. We were lying in our usual arrangement, back to back, the silence stretching between us. He hadn't spoken tonight. The quiet felt different, not empty, but full. It was humming with a low-frequency energy I couldn't identify. I was on the verge of sleep, my mind finally beginning to drift, when I felt him move. It wasn't the usual unconscious shift. It was a deliberate, considered motion. He rolled over, slowly, the mattress creaking softly in protest. I felt the warmth of his body now along the entire length of my back. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My breathing hitched. I waited. For what, I didn't know. For him to roll away again, to retreat to the safety of his side. But he didn't. He just lay there, his breath a warm presence near my shoulder. The silence stretched, becoming so taut I thought it might snap. I could feel my own pulse, a frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. My mind was a chaotic storm of questions. What was this? What did he want? What was I supposed to do? The ambiguity I had been living in for months was suddenly crystallizing into a single, terrifying moment of decision. Jules. His voice was a whisper, barely a breath. It was so close to my ear that it felt less like a sound and more like a physical touch. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was lie there, my back to him, and wait. Are you awake? I managed a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the most I could offer. He was quiet for another long moment. I could feel him gathering himself, as if preparing to jump from a great height. Then, he spoke again, his voice even lower, laced with a raw, trembling vulnerability that I had never heard from him before. "Would it be okay?" he began, and then he paused, the words catching in his throat. He took a breath. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The sound of the city outside, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the very passage of time, it all ceased to exist. There was only his question, hanging in the space between us. It was not a proposition. It was not a seduction. It was a plea. It was a question of permission, of safety. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and he was asking me if it was safe to jump. And in that moment, all my fear, all my anxiety, all the months of torturous uncertainty, they all evaporated, burned away by the stunning, simple honesty of his words. There was no more ambiguity. There was no more tightrope. There was only his question and my answer. I turned over, slowly, my movements feeling heavy, as if I were moving through water. I turned until I was facing him. In the faint light filtering in from the street, I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes wide and searching in the darkness. He was waiting. I didn't need words. I simply closed the small distance that remained between us. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft, hesitant. It was a question mirroring his own. It was a moment of pure, terrifying discovery. And then he responded. A soft sigh escaped his lips, a sound of surrender, of relief, and he deepened the kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, not in the way the movies show you. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was quiet, and it was tender, and it was drenched in a profound, unspoken gratitude. It was the final, beautiful image resolving in the dark, and it was clearer and more perfect than anything I could have ever hoped for. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. The space beside me was cool to the touch, the indentation of his head on the pillow already fading. For a moment, a cold, sharp panic seized me. Had I dreamed it? Had the entire night been a figment of my own desperate imagination? But then I saw it. On his pillow, there was a single, folded piece of paper. My heart hammered as I reached for it. It wasn't a note. It was a photograph. It was one of mine, a small print I'd made weeks ago and left on my desk. It was a simple, black-and-white shot of the view from my apartment window on a rainy day, the city lights blurred into soft, abstract shapes through the water-streaked glass. I didn't understand. Why had he left this? I turned it over. On the back, in his familiar, sharp handwriting, were 3 words. "I'm so sorry." The bottom fell out of my world. Sorry? Sorry for what? For the kiss? For the confession it represented? The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest just hours before withered and died, turning to ash. I had been wrong. I had misread everything. I wasn't his safe harbor. I was a port in a storm, a temporary convenience. The intimacy, the whispered confessions, the kiss, it had all been a symptom of his loneliness, not a sign of genuine affection for me. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, sickening wave that washed over me. I had been a fool, a sentimental idiot who had projected his own feelings onto a situation that had nothing to do with them. He wasn't jumping to me. He was just jumping away from his own pain. He disappeared. For 3 days, there was nothing. My texts went unanswered. My calls went straight to voicemail. The silence from him was a deafening roar that filled every corner of my apartment, which now felt vast and achingly empty. Every surface seemed to hold the ghost of his presence. The couch where he used to sleep, the coffee mug he favored, the empty side of my bed. They were all monuments to my own stupidity. The ritual was broken, the spell shattered. I moved through my days in a haze of hurt and confusion. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I tried to lose myself in my darkroom, but the process that had always been my solace now felt like a mockery. How could I trust my own eyes to bring an image to light when I had been so blind? On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any potential confirmation of my fears. I needed to hear it from him. I needed the final, brutal clarity. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me it was a mistake, so that I could begin the long, painful process of rebuilding the walls he had so effortlessly dismantled. I put on my coat, my hands shaking slightly as I fumbled with the buttons, and walked the 12 blocks to his apartment. I had only been there a handful of times before, back when he and Chloe were still together. It was in a newer, more sterile building than mine, the kind of place with a clean, impersonal lobby. As I stood outside his door, my heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing in the unnervingly quiet hallway. For a long moment, there was no answer. I was about to turn and leave, to retreat back to my own misery, when I heard the sound of the deadbolt turning. The door opened a few inches. Leo stood there, looking even more overexposed and washed out than he had the day after his breakup. His hair was a mess, there were dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked wrecked. He didn't seem surprised to see me, just resigned. He didn't say anything, just opened the door wider and stepped back to let me in. His apartment was a reflection of his own state. It was dark, the blinds drawn against the afternoon light. There were takeout containers on the coffee table, clothes strewn over a chair. It felt stagnant, airless. It was the loneliest place I had ever been. He didn't gesture for me to sit. He just stood in the middle of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. The silence stretched between us, thick with accusations and unspoken pain. I was the one who had to break it. Why? I asked, my voice coming out as a croak. I cleared my throat and tried again, forcing the word out with more strength. Why, Leo? He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a spot on the floor just past my left shoulder. I told you, he said, his voice flat. I'm sorry. Sorry isn't an explanation. I shot back, a flare of anger cutting through the hurt. Sorry for what? For kissing me? Or for running away like a coward the morning after? He flinched at the word coward. It hit its mark. You don't understand, he muttered. Then make me understand. I said, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used me. It looks like you needed a warm body, a place to hide from your own life. And you took what you needed, and then you got scared and you ran. Tell me I'm wrong, Leo. Please, just tell me I'm wrong. He finally looked at me then, and his eyes were swimming with a turmoil that silenced me. It wasn't malice or indifference I saw there. It was pure, unadulterated fear. Of course you're wrong, he whispered, his voice cracking. God, Jules. You're so wrong. He sank onto the edge of his couch as if his legs could no longer support him and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders started to shake. It was a quiet, desperate kind of crying, and the sight of it broke me. The anger drained out of me, replaced by the familiar, aching need to comfort him. I crossed the room and sat down next to him, leaving a careful foot of space between us. After a few moments, he lifted his head, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. He took a long, shuddering breath. I don't, he struggled for the words. I've never felt that way. For a guy. He set it to the floor, as if the confession was too heavy to be aimed directly at me. My whole life, there's been a path. You know? A map. You go to school, you get a good job, you meet a great girl, you get married. That's the map. Chloe was part of the map. And it was fine. It was comfortable. But it was like I was following the directions without ever looking up at the scenery. He finally turned his head to look at me. And then there was you. You were never on the map. You were just there. This quiet, solid person who actually saw me. The real me. Not the sprinter, not the consultant. Just me. He took another breath, the words starting to flow more easily now that the dam was broken. When Chloe and I ended, it was like the map just burst into flames. I was completely lost. And the only place I wanted to be was with you. In your quiet apartment. It was the only place that felt real. The only place I could breathe. He paused, his gaze intense. That night, when I kissed you, that wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing I've done in my entire life. And it terrified me. Because it meant the map was gone forever. It meant I had no idea who I was, or where I was going. All I knew was that I wanted to go there with you. And that feeling was so big, so overwhelming. I couldn't handle it. So I ran. Because that's what I do. I'm a sprinter. I run away from things that scare me. He reached out then and picked up the photograph from his coffee table, the one he had left on my pillow. He held it out to me. I left this because, I don't know. It felt like the only way I could explain. It's how you see the world. You find the beauty in something blurry, something that other people would just see as a mess. You have the patience to wait for the image to develop. And I'm a mess, Jules. I'm blurry. And I was hoping you'd have the patience to wait for me. All the air left my body in a rush. I looked from the photograph in his hand to his face, and I saw everything with a sudden, painful clarity. The fear, the confusion, the yearning. It was all there. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a future he had never imagined, a future that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He wasn't using me for comfort. He was finding comfort in something real and being terrified by its implications. I closed the space between us on the couch and took his hand. His fingers were cold. I laced my own through them, holding on tight. "You're not a mess," I said softly. "You're just developing." The metaphor felt clumsy on my tongue, but it was the truest thing I could say. "And I'm not going anywhere." A single tear traced a path down his cheek, but this time, he was smiling. A small, watery, but genuine smile. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." We didn't magically fix everything in that moment. There was no grand, cinematic kiss to resolve the tension. We just sat there, on his couch, in his dark and lonely apartment, holding hands. But it was a start. It was a new foundation, built not on ambiguity and unspoken needs, but on a fragile, terrifying, and beautiful honesty. We talked for hours. We talked until the afternoon light faded and the room was filled with the blue glow of evening. He told me about the hollow ache of his life before, and I told him about the secret room I had kept locked inside me for years. We laid all our cards on the table, all our fears and all our hopes. It was the most difficult and the most liberating conversation of my life. That night, I stayed at his apartment. When it grew late, he looked at me, a question in his eyes. "You don't have to," he said. "I get it if it's too much." I just shook my head and squeezed his hand. "Let's go to bed," I said. His bedroom was as neglected as the rest of the apartment, but it didn't matter. We lay down facing each other, the space between us no longer a chasm, but a shared territory. He reached out and traced the line of my jaw with his thumb, his touch tentative, reverent. "Is this okay?" he whispered, the echo of his first, fateful question. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It's more than okay." He leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of certainty, of acceptance. It was a promise. We didn't do anything more than that. We just held each other, and for the first time in a long time, we both slept through the entire night. The days that followed were a process of gentle excavation, of learning a new language together. We took it slowly. We were two people relearning how to walk after a long time of being still. There were moments of awkwardness, of uncertainty. We had to navigate the transition from the deeply ingrained habits of friendship to the tentative explorations of something more. But underneath it all, there was a profound sense of rightness, of peace. We began to build a new ritual, one based on choice, not necessity. He started spending his nights at my place again, but now, he brought a bag with him. He left his things out in the open. His toothbrush appeared next to mine in the ceramic holder, no longer hidden in the back of the cabinet. His clothes found their way into my drawers, not as a temporary overflow, but as a permanent addition. We reclaimed the spaces. My bed was no longer a landscape of boundaries and unspoken rules. It was simply our bed. We discovered the simple, profound joy of domestic intimacy. Making coffee together in the morning, the comfortable silence punctuated by the clink of spoons against ceramic. Reading side by side on the couch, his leg resting against mine. Me, working in my darkroom with the door open, knowing he was just on the other side, his presence a steady, comforting weight. He started to bring his own life into my space. His laptop appeared on my kitchen table. His running shoes found a home by the door next to mine. My quiet sanctuary for one was slowly, beautifully, becoming a shared home for two. He began to heal. The haunted, exhausted look in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a light I hadn't seen in years. He started smiling more, that easy, brilliant smile that had first drawn me to him across a crowded practice field. But this smile was different. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was real. He was learning to live off the map, to navigate by the stars of his own feelings rather than by the rigid grid lines of expectation. And I was changing, too. The walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart began to come down, brick by brick. The quiet observer was learning to be a participant. I found myself sharing my own fears, my own insecurities, in a way I never had before. He became my safe harbor, just as I had been his. One Saturday morning, I woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the soft morning light filtering through the blinds. I rolled over and saw him standing by the window, a mug in his hand, looking out at the city. He was wearing one of my old t-shirts, and the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air around him, creating a halo of gold. He turned and saw me watching him, and he smiled that new, real smile. He walked over to the bed and sat on the edge, leaning down to kiss me. It was a soft, sleepy, domestic kiss that tasted of coffee and contentment. "Morning," he murmured against my lips. "Morning," I replied, my voice rough with sleep. He settled back, looking at me, his expression full of a quiet wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe this was real. And in that moment, I saw the photograph I had been trying to capture for years. It wasn't a picture of him alone, or of me watching him from a distance. It was a picture of us, clear and bright and perfectly in focus. We never need to be rescued from our lives. Sometimes, we just need a safe place to land while we learn to fly again. We need a quiet room where we can sit with our own blurry, undeveloped images until we find the courage to bring them into the light. Leo and I found that room in each other. It wasn't a grand romance written in the stars, but a quiet love story written in the margins of our ordinary days, in shared silences, in late-night confessions to the dark, in the simple, revolutionary act of turning to face each other. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the profound, unspoken certainty of home.